family secrets. King Solomon was a guy in the Old Testament. We're going to encounter him in 1 Kings today. And so if you have one of the Bibles, you can already get there. You'll notice that later on we're going to hit page 234. So you can flip there now if you want, but I want to give you a little bit of his backstory. And the backstory has some blanks. If you're following along with the note sheets, you can jot these things down. It'll help you have a little understanding of the history of this guy, Solomon. When it came to family issues, here's the first thing you need to write down. Solomon had little help from his parents. I imagine that's true for many of you too. Solomon had little help from his parents, and many of you probably have had little help from your parents. I don't know what kind of parental situation you had growing up or what kind of parental situation you feel like you're in now, but Solomon had it worse. Check this out. I'm just going to list off some of these things. Number one, his dad, who was King David, the greatest king of all time in ancient Israel, his dad, it says, had shed much blood. In 1 Chronicles 22, verse 8, David is told by God that he has shed too much blood in his life to be the person who will build a temple for God. God says, I want your son Solomon to build this temple. You have been too much of a warrior and you've shed too much blood. And if you build the temple, people are going to get the idea that I'm a God of war. And I'm not really a God of war and wrath and fighting and bloodshed and all that kind of stuff. People need to know that I'm a God of peace and I want to be in peaceful relationship with people. So your son Solomon is going to build this temple. Okay? But his dad David was a multiple times over warrior, shedder of blood. And then number two, his dad David was also a murdering adulterer. In 2 Samuel 11, we read of a story where David finds this woman Bathsheba, and she is married to one of his best generals. And he decides to go ahead and kind of rape her, because as a king, he can get whatever he wants. He decides to basically rape her, later on finds out she's pregnant, so then he kills Uriah and sends him off to war, and then tells all the other generals to step away from Uriah so that he'll be on the front lines all by himself and get whacked. And so David basically assassinates one of his best soldiers because he got that guy's wife pregnant. Well, that baby eventually died. After it was born, it only lived for a few days and then died. And so then David, to comfort Bathsheba, took her to be his wife. And then we get to point number 3. Solomon was the child of that adultery. Solomon was the child that was born to Bathsheba after her first child had died, after her first husband had been killed, and after David had done all this stuff. So if you just look at the situation, I mean, Solomon came into the world as an underdog when it comes to family issues. You can look at this stuff more. You can see stuff about David's other sons and how warped they were. You can see other stuff about Solomon's mom and how she was kind of warped and twisted and didn't really get a lot of things. You can find out that Solomon really had it bad as far as having a head start on what it means to be a good family. But as a king, he had a great image. I mean, he had everything going for him. He had a wonderful image. Check this out. In 1 Kings 3, verses 16 through 28. If you're following along in the Bibles there, it's on page 234. I'm going to go ahead and read this so you can kind of get a picture of Solomon. The first thing is that Solomon was incredibly wise. 3:16 through 28 says this. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king, Solomon, and stood before him. One of them said, "My lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I had a baby while she was there with me. The 3rd day after my child was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the 2 of us. During the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning, I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born." The other woman said, "No, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours." But the first one insisted, "No, the dead one is yours, the living one is mine." And so they argued before the king. The king said, "This one says, my son is alive and your son is dead. While that one says, no, your son is dead and mine is alive." Then the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, "Cut the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other." The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." But the other said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Then the king gave this ruling: "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." When all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. I know many of you have heard that story before, and if you haven't heard the story from the Bible, you've probably heard the story retold a number of times. Two people are arguing about something. Someone says, "Okay, cut the bicycle in two, cut the baby in two, cut the Snickers bar in two," whatever. And they say this kind of thing, and it all came from Solomon. If you've ever seen Looney Tunes or anyone else spoof this kind of story, it all came from Solomon. Solomon's the guy who came up with this incredibly wise idea of the person who loves more will be willing to give up rather than to destroy. Solomon figured that out. He's an incredibly wise guy in the good sense. 1 Kings 4, 29 through 34. Just the next chapter over, beginning in verse 29, we read this. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Darda. I imagine these guys were the smart guys of the day. The sons of Mahal, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. This guy was the smartest guy who ever lived. He had his brain filled with all the wise sayings of his day. He had written songs, 1,005 songs, and people came from all over the world to find out from this guy what he knew. And because he was so popular and because his wisdom ranged around the world, he became very rich. Look at 1 Kings 10:14. I've printed it on your note sheet there. It says, "The weight of the gold that Solomon received yearly was 666 talents." Now, talents was a measurement of weight. And today, a talent, the way it all works out, 666 talents would be about 25 tons. I did the math, and if you convert tons of gold to the current price of gold per ounce, which by